Next up, we'll hear about crime and justice in the age of Me Too. Please welcome Piper Kerman, the author of Orange is the New Black. Nikki Jones is an associate professor of African American Studies at UC Berkeley. Amy Fettig is deputy director of the National Prison Project at the ACLU. And Lashonia Thompson-El, executive director of women involved in Reentry Efforts. Here to lead the conversation is my colleague Adrienne Green, managing editor at The Atlantic.
Welcome. So since the Weinstein allegations in 2017 and the subsequent Me Too movement that has arisen since, people are having a lot of conversations about, in Hollywood, in politics, in business, about sexual assault and trauma and reassessing best practices in all of these spaces. And I'm really curious about how the criminal justice system is reckoning, with this moment alongside all of these other places. Social movements like Me Too and Time's Up are getting a lot of attention about women coming forward, telling their stories, but a lot of who the loudest voices are also informed by things like race and class. What's next for the movement, and who do you think is getting left out of the conversation at this moment? Anybody can answer.
You want me to go first?
Yeah.
So again, I'm Lashonia Thompson-El. I'm the executive director of The Wire, Women Involved in Reentry Efforts. So I was born and raised here in DC. The women who I believe are being left out of the conversation, unfortunately, are Black women and girls. Because as we know, they are the individuals who are being incarcerated at the highest rates, and most of them are survivors of trauma as a result of sexual abuse. And so we've known this prior to the Me Too movement, but unfortunately, these girls are the same girls who lived in our most impoverished communities. They go to the worst schools, and they have the least amount of representation. So they are left out of the conversation. And it's very difficult for me to say this publicly, but the girls I'm speaking about are being hurt by Black men in their families and men who are friends of their families. So it's very difficult for us as a community to be honest about these conversations. And so for those reasons, I believe Black women and girls are left out of the conversation.
Piper?
I think I'm happy. I live in Columbus, and I was very fortunate a couple weeks ago to hear Tarana Burke speak, the woman who actually coined the hashtag and started the movement, the Me Too movement. And she is, of course, an African-American woman and a tremendous leader and very focused on making sure that some of the people who have not been front and center in recent months get the attention and the support and the healing that they deserve and that everybody who's a survivor of sexual violence deserves. I think that clearly, the people who are potentially gaining the most traction and justice at this moment are women who are most powerful. And that tends to hew to white women and wealthy women. And the vast majority of other women are left out of that picture in a host of ways. Certainly in terms of things like coverage and attention, but more importantly, the question of how people are being held accountable for sexual violence has been very much confined to certain areas like entertainment or the media. So we have seen men who are abusive and in some cases violent removed from positions of power in those purviews, but not in law enforcement, where we know that sexual violence is a part of police violence, not in more conservative environs, not in government very much. So these things should concern us. I think that one of the things that's not getting discussed sufficiently in discussing, sort of Me Too, is this question of what does accountability look like, right? Mm-hmm. So if we're not satisfied or content with what accountability has looked at like up until now, what is it that we want going forward? Because what we know is that sexual violence is so pervasive and widespread. There are women and girls and boys who are surviving sexual violence in every community. We can't build enough prison and jail cells to put every perpetrator of sexual violence in prison. And I teach in prisons. I teach in a men's medium security prison. I teach in a women's state prison. I can tell you that those institutions are not well positioned to put a stop to hierarchical, dominance-oriented, or patriarchal behaviors. And so I think one of the questions that needs to be taken up is, what does a cessation of sexual violence look like, and how can that take place in the community rather than relying on the carceral state to do it?
I want to ask you the same question you just asked the room. What does it look like?
Oh, I think that the kind of accountability that we want, first of all, recognizes that law is an instrument of power and not an instrument of justice. And so we need to think about what delivers justice to survivors. We have to have a response to violence that is survivor-centered, that puts the survivor and his or her needs, because again, men are survivors of sexual violence sometimes, as their central question. Like, what does that person need to be safe, to be whole, to begin to heal? What do we need to do that does hold the perpetrator accountable, but also helps create an end to that behavior? And again, a prison or a jail cell will immobilize a person, but it won't necessarily end that behavior. Anyone who knows statistics around prison sexual assault can tell you that. And also, I think, what will address racial inequity? I think that we have to ask those questions in all of our responses to violence and crime and disorder in the community. And to whatever extent, I think that we need to address these things prior to them ever touching the criminal justice system.
I'm so glad that you talked about power being at the center of these conversations about Me Too and sexual violence. Policing, which is kind of the first entry point to the criminal justice system, is a male-dominated field, and it deploys its own kind of complicated systems of power that manifests itself in sometimes really terrible ways. An example I can think of is 2015. There was a teenage girl in a bathing suit had an officer kneeling on her back and pinning her to a sidewalk. That wasn't an instrument of sexual violence, but it was a demonstration of power and having really expansive conversations about what violence and trauma mean. How do you think that law enforcement is dealing with this moment, given the sensitivity to expanding our definition of violence?
I want to pick up and kind of answer that question, but speak to the accountability point and think about accountability for whom, right? And what does that look like? And work I think about are the communities that Lashonia was talking about, poor Black women and girls, where the line between perpetrator and victim is tangled, right? And so this morning we were talking about the system, and someone described the system as rigid, brutal, and cruel. Right? And someone else told us a story about a juvenile justice system in which kids were getting beaten and sexually assaulted. And we kind of take that in as a kind of normal part of the system. And part, I think, of what Piper was saying is that kind of violence has become normalized, right? And we know that it exists behind prison walls, and it's true when it comes to policing, it also exists on the outside. And so in my experience, I've talked with young people who have been strip searched in their neighborhoods, right? So they get picked up, they get taken to the local police station, they come back, right? And now they have to see officers who saw the most intimate parts of their bodies, right? And that kind of mirrors the experience of sexual assault in which a perpetrator is still in the community. And one of the points that I make is that experience, that frustration, that anger, that humiliation goes somewhere. And that gets to the point that you were talking about. Who does it go to? It goes to the people who are closest to you, the people who are on the lower end of the pecking order. And so when we think about the perpetrator, we have to think about the interconnection between structural forms of violence, how that moves through people's bodies and minds and onto other people. And if we think about it in that way, the site of intervention to whom we keep accountable is not just one person, right? It's much broader than that. Right, yeah.
And I think, in the context of Me Too, in this moment that has now opened up, the question is, how do we build more accountability? And how do we hold the Me Too movement accountable and ourselves accountable for recognizing that while it is shocking that in the media and in places of power there was this hidden sexual harassment that everybody knew about and sexual violence that no one wanted to talk about, we have to consider that those were people who were not held in cages. They could walk away. For women and girls in the criminal justice system, they can't walk away. And people don't know what's happening. They don't have access to the media. Oftentimes they don't have much access to friends or family. And they live in fear. So that even reporting sexual harassment or sexual violence is a dangerous act. You can be placed in solitary confinement. You can be retaliated against. You can be denied visits or calls with your friends and family. There's so many ways in which women and girls are more vulnerable. And so when we think about Me Too and the changes that need to happen outside of prison walls, we have to also include what happens behind prison walls. And frankly, this system was not built up overnight. It's been happening all along, and Americans chose not to see. We have the largest carceral state the world has ever seen, and it happened in our backyards, and we knew it was there, but we didn't want to know what was happening. We chose to throw those folks away. So it's now time to open up the prison doors. That's how you hold people more accountable, starting with yourself.
What are some things that you wish that people knew about the experience of women in prisons? We all know that women don't experience prison in the same way as men. The prisons are not constructed in the same way. They're not policed in the same way. They're not, the people that work in them are not trained in the same way or trained to the needs of the people, of the populations inside of those prisons. What are some things that all of you wish that people knew about the experience of women in prisons?
Yeah, Lashonia. One of the things I wanted to add to your comment was that the reason why I believe that it's important to pay attention to how systemic and endemic violence leads to trauma and shows up in behavior is because, just like the rest of the nation, DC has seen a spike in the incarceration of girls. So the boys' rates are pretty much steady, and the girls' rates have risen dramatically across the nation and in DC. And most of their offenses, these girls, are aggressive, violent offenses because of the trauma that they've experienced in their homes, and it's showing up in their daily lives. And so they become criminalized and become incarcerated, and then that trauma is made worse as a result of what they experience when they are incarcerated. And so if I could share something that I would like people to know without being too graphic, is that there are some women who actually have to strip search in front of men. And they actually have to literally like squat and cough in front of men. There are some facilities where women have to use the restroom and handle their feminine needs while their doors are exposed, and most of the guards are males, white males, and they get to walk around and look at will if you're dressing after a shower or using the restroom or whatever it is, getting dressed or whatever it is that you may be doing. And the last thing is that, you know, it's totally unrelated, but there are still women who are being shackled while they're in labor. And it's a whole lot of different things that's going on within the criminal justice system that I wish people knew that's not related to this subject. But for me, I think those are the most important things, that the women in prison have survived trauma, and then they're in prison and they're being subjected to more physical abuse and violated in ways that is making their trauma worse. And then they return to the community, and there's an expectation that they will miraculously, successfully reintegrate and reunify their families. It's not realistic.
Piper, you look like you had something to add.
I think it's just very important for people to know. I get asked questions all the time about the difference between men in the system and women in the system, and there are more similarities in many ways than there are differences. There are many men who are survivors of sexual violence as well who end up incarcerated. However, the numbers are sky high for women. You know, between 80 and 90% of incarcerated women are survivors of sexual violence or other physical violence. And the experience of incarceration is very intentionally designed to be traumatizing. And the ways that you described are examples of how a survivor of sexual violence is re-traumatized, comes out of prison or jail in worse shape than she went in. And the prospect of for an incarcerated woman to gain justice from the system that incarcerates her is negligible, right? Several years ago, the Senate Judiciary Committee held a hearing on solitary confinement. Solitary confinement is often used as a punitive measure for whistleblowers in prison, including whistleblowers who report sexual violence within the facility. And Senator Hirono made a very astute connection. She brought up the issue of enlisted women in the military's inability to gain justice from that system in which they need to operate. Also a hierarchical, dominance-oriented, and patriarchal system, and near impossible for those women who are in the military who experience sexual violence to gain justice. And it's the same for incarcerated women and girls.
I just wanted to add, it's the prototypical, this is so much about culture. And you've got these quasi-military and military institutions where dominance and patriarchy are part of the culture. And so when we're talking about how do we hold people accountable and how do we change things, this is a cultural shift. And that means it takes a lot of energy and a lot of work over a long period of time. To make real change, it's not going to be a matter of months or even one presidency.
What do you think would actually make women's lives better in these prisons? How could these institutions, if they are to exist, serve women better for the needs that they have?
Well, I would say, first of all, the vast majority of women don't need to be in prison. And that's
right. That's what I would say too.
They could be better served and with no public safety impacts if there was drug treatment, if there was mental health care treatment, if there was actually a social safety net in this country. Right now we use our carceral state as the only viable social safety net, and it's the worst form of social safety net you could possibly come up with. So yeah, get women out of prison. But for those that remain, the handful that might be there, oriented towards treatment. The criminal justice system should be a moment of crisis where other things have failed, and this is your moment to actually help this person get their life back on track. But it instead debilitates people so they come out far worse and more traumatized than when they went in. There's no reason we have to do that. We choose to do it that way. And part of it is because we have so many people in prison for no good reason. And we don't, although it costs us billions of dollars, we are not actually putting in the kind of time, care, and money it requires to help people. And so we warehouse them.
Nikki, I want to pull you back into this conversation.
I'm just thinking.
I'm just digesting, taking it in. How does thinking about incarceration in this highly patriarchal and male-oriented way, how does it impact how we improve prisons, like policy-wise and service-wise? What disservice are we doing by thinking about it in a male-oriented way?
I don't know if I can answer that question directly, but and because the idea of improving, one of the things that's so heartening about being in this space is that there are so many people who are progressive within the system and are going to make changes, are going to make practices that I think or change practices that I think are going to be consequential for the people that they come in touch with every day. And I think that's so important. But the idea of improving prison broadly, I don't know if that's our goal, right, is to improve. I think we want to get to a place where we don't need prison. That's the kind of more transformative thinking, I think. And this conversation about the system not being set up to be an arbiter of justice when it comes to sexual violence for women or for men, I just want, one of the things I was thinking about is that this is what Black feminist scholars and activists were talking about like 30 years ago. When we, shifted to what was a victory in the minds of some folks, and it was a victory in some ways, to using the criminal justice system to respond to violence against women and other kinds at a moment where it was becoming more harsh. And so that's to say that some ideas about how we might organize ourselves, think about justice, exist, right? We don't, in fact, have to create something entirely new. There are visions of justice from communities that have, discussions that have existed before this moment that I think we can go back to when we are imagining what can be done, what's possible.
Absolutely. It seems like everyone in this panel is in agreement that prison is the imperfect system to do the real healing for the trauma that people experience even before they enter the carceral system at all. Lashonia, I want to talk to you about WIRE and reentry and what community organizations are out there and the resources that you've either experienced or helped build to deal with this?
So I started The Wire in 2013 while working at the Mayor's Office on Returning Citizen Affairs here in DC. And basically The Wire is a group of women who were formerly incarcerated. And we all came together to form a network so that we could serve as peer mentors and peer advocates to one another, to other returning women, and to women who remain incarcerated. So some of the things that we've done have been around visitation, making sure that children who have incarcerated mothers have access to visitation. And while I was at MORCA, we was able to start a visitation trip. So now they go like twice a year to SFF Hazleton, where most of the DC women are located. And it's free of charge. So caregivers are able to afford to take children to visit their moms. So that speaks to one of the things you was talking about earlier. Why is it a problem when we look at the criminal justice system as a male-dominated system? Because most of the people in prison are men, even though, again, women are the fastest growing group of people that are becoming incarcerated. However, the majority of the women in prison are also mothers. And so most of them have underage children who are left out here to, with caregivers to basically fend for themselves. Some end up in the foster care system, which is a whole nother pipeline. And I was grateful to return to the District of Columbia because here we have a lot of progressive reentry efforts that afforded me an opportunity to create a platform for the women that I serve time with and women who are still incarcerated because I'm thinking people in here may know that we don't have a prison system here in DC. So most of the DC prisoners who are serving time for felony convictions or over a year, they go into the federal system, which means we have women in Waseca, Minnesota, we have women in Aliceville, Alabama, Carswell, Texas. Again, these women have minor children who live here in the District of Columbia, and they don't have access to visitation most often. So just because MORCA is going to Hazleton, that doesn't mean that the child who has a mom in Carswell, Texas will get the visit. And so DC has just done a great job, in my opinion, of allowing people who have been directly impacted to inform the work, to inform policy, to be in positions where they can help bring a transformative justice piece to into the picture.
I want to thank you guys so much. Before I turn it over, I want to open the floor up for questions and give people the opportunity to really ask you guys anything that might be on their minds. I know there's a mic floating around the room at this time.
All right. Oh, they're so shy.
Shy, tough crowd. Heavy subject. Well, while we're thinking, there's a question in the back.
Hi, I'm Andrea Ritchie. I'm a researcher at the Barnard Center for Research on Women, and just wanted to applaud and appreciate the focus on police sexual violence as something that has been very much excluded, and then sort of thinking about the conversation and what you were saying, Piper, about what solutions might be, that the criminal legal system is not a solution for that either, for the reasons that we just described, that the women who are targeted are the women who are targeted by the criminal legal system generally and are not going to get justice in those systems. So I think there's been a lot of focus recently on amending criminal laws to eliminate a consent defense for police officers who sexually assault people in custody. Obviously, that's a positive step. No one should have to argue that they consented or didn't when they're in handcuffs, but it's not enough. It's way too limited as a response because much of the sexual assault that takes place or harassment takes place when women are not in custody. Police officers target domestic violence survivors, victims, people in explorer programs, children in schools that they patrol. None of those people are in custody. So none of these laws are going to address that. And then also so few cases actually get to criminal prosecution because there's little evidence often other than the word of the person who's been sexually assaulted. So I just want to encourage us all. There was a previous conversation about data collection. This is an area we don't do any data collection in, including in the initiatives that we're talking about here today. And without data collection, we don't get to points of prevention, detection, and accountability in the ways that we've been talking about. So I just want to lift those thoughts up and appreciate the centering of that in the conversation.
Absolutely. We have a question in the center right here.
Roberta Myers from Legal Action Center. Thanks to all of you. I love all of you. LaShawn, I want you to possibly talk a little bit more about how important it is to have women who are directly impacted being able to get the support that they need to help the rest of our sisters who are living the experience that they have walked through. How important, and tell me how hard it was in terms of building your organization and bringing in other women who want to do the work, but there's all types of barriers that get in the way. How have you worked to address that?
Well, as of now, the Wire is an organization that still has not been funded and still has not received the amount of support that I believe we should from the city or from, you know, private funders or whatever. But a part of it is because most of us we're in the reentry process ourselves, and we have a learning curve, and we all work full-time jobs and have families that we're trying to reunify, but we believe in civic engagement and we care about the women that we left behind, so we do this, you know, out of passion and because we were compelled to do it. So some people look at us like just a group of friends who hang out and don't really think that the work is effective, or they don't believe in the work. But what I do know is that several women have come home, and because of the relationships that we have built, we've been able to refer women. It's a woman that came home maybe like 30 days, maybe 60 days ago now. She was able to get into the Aspire program, start to pursue an entrepreneurship effort that she's about to start her own company. She's in transitional housing, and she's just so involved in the community, going to NA meetings and just doing her thing. And I often sit back and wonder, like, wow, what would have happened if I didn't know these people that I was able to connect her to, right? Because when you have lived through that experience, one thing to see a list of resources on a piece of paper, it's another thing to actually know what resources work because you've used them. And so that's what we've basically been able to not just direct women to resources, but actually help them navigate those resources, and just putting women in a position where they can actually like speak up in policy meetings and testify before city council. I think it's really been important for the returning women to just gain agency over their lives and be accountability for, accept some accountability for their past actions, but also, you know, have the agency to try to make a difference and give back to the community. So we're still a work in progress, but it's not something that we would ever not do with or without support.
Well, on that note, Piper, Nikki, Amy, Lashonia, thank you so much for joining us and telling us your stories.
Thank you.